everybody. Good evening. Welcome in another part of the course titled Essentials of Clinical Lipidology course. It was very interesting, enjoyable course. I would like to thank the faculty and thank the Novarts for their unrestricted CME grant cooperation with IABA. I will lead the mic now to the moderator of the session, Professor Mohammed Salim from Heart Institute, Professor Noamani, Head of Cardiology Department, Menofia University, and Professor Walid Abdul from Menofia University. Tfadal, Dr. Salim, Dr. Noamani.
And thank you, Dr. Ashraf. It's our pleasure to join the fourth wave of the essentials of lipidology, and it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Professor Atif Al-Bahari, Professor of Cardiovascular Medicine for Said, and the Vice President of the IABA, Egyptian Association of Vascular Biology and Atherosclerosis. He will give us very important topic about the genetic targets and novel therapies in lipid management. Professor Atif.
Thank you very much, Professor Ashraf, Professor Mohammed Salim, for the introduction. Genetic targets is very important because it produces novel therapies and lipid management. And if you look here for this important slide, we can see from a meta-analysis of 3,012 subjects with long-term exposure to naturally low levels of LDL cholesterol resulting from 9 different polymorphism in 6 genes, the SORT1, the PCK9, the LDR, the HMGCR, the ABCGB, the ApoE, all show that lifelong exposure to low LDL cholesterol due to single nucleotide polymorphism SNPs reduces the risk of coronary heart disease by 54.5% for each millimole lower of LDL cholesterol. We know that the traditional lipid management we use now is lifestyle modification, statins, ezetimibe, and the PCK9 monoclonal antibodies. Focusing on genetics, the pipeline development is huge. There is an urgent need for novel therapeutic strategies to lower the residual risk of cardiovascular events in statin-treated patients, as well as to manage dyslipidemia in non-responders or statin-intolerant subjects and patients with genetic defects. If we look here carefully and we focus on genetically altered LDL cholesterol, triglyceride, and the risk for coronary heart disease, we will find that for every one standard deviation change of about 35 milligram per deciliter in genetically altered LDL cholesterol, 50% increase in risk for coronary heart disease. And for every one standard deviation change, about 90 milligram per deciliter in genetically altered triglyceride, we find that 50% increase in risk for coronary heart disease. Well, and what does it mean? That we can see here the resistance mutations fall into 3 pathways: the LDL, the lipoprotein A, the triglyceride-rich lipoprotein. We can find here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 genes, the PCK9 genes, which is found in 1 in every 50 person. The Niemann-Pick C1, L1 is found in 1 in every 650. The ApoB is 1 in 1086. The lipoprotein A gene is found in 1 in 71, and the ApoC3 1 in 150, and the ANGPTL3 1 in 300, and the ANGPTL4 is 1 in 360, and the ACGR1 1 in 120. We don't want to confuse with these names because we know that genetic data show that a loss of function variant in the ACGR1 is associated with reduced levels of non-HDL cholesterol and confers protection against coronary artery disease. And we can see here also the angiopoietin-like protein 3, which is very important in abolishing the triglyceride. So we if we continue, the 8 genes that harbor the myocardial resistance mutations here, if we mutate these genes like the PCK9, we will find that LDL will be reduced or abolished, and we will have an 80% lower risk reduction of myocardial infarction risk. The Niemann-Pick C1L1, as we see here, will acting on the LDL, we will have a decrease for 53% lower risk of MI, and the ApoB reduction of risk by 72% lower risk, the LPA 24% lower risk, the ApoC3 40% lower risk, and the ANGPTL3 will be reduced by 34 lower risk. The ANGPTL4 will be reduced by 53%, and lastly, the ACGR1 will be reduced by 34%. Here we can see the genetic technologies used by biotech to develop novel therapies here are fully human monoclonal antibodies, which are occurring now, the antisense oligonucleotides, the ASO, the small interfering RNA, and the CRISPR. The CRISPR is a clustered, regularly interspaced, short palindromic repeats. And we can see here the targets of RNA-based drugs for atherosclerotic disease prevention. When we target the messenger RNA to make a degradation by the siRNA or ASO, we'll attack the PCK9, the ApoC3, the ApoA, and the ANGPTL3. So if we speak about the PCK9, here, we will see that many drugs now are developing to prevent the reduction of the PCK9 messenger RNA, to prevent the protein PCK9, so increasing the LDL receptor and decreasing the LDL cholesterol. We have the monoclonal antibodies now, but now in process the single-stranded antisense oligonucleotides and the gene editing and the double-stranded small interfering RNA gene editing, and lastly the vaccine. So all the trials now are going on the messenger RNA of the PCK9 in order to abolish its action, to increase the LDL receptor, and to decrease the LDL cholesterol and reduction of atherosclerosis. The first of them is inclisiran. Inclisiran is a small interfering RNA. It's siRNA targeting PCK9 mechanism of action, showing that the GNAC siRNA conjugate with the thioglycoprotein receptor entering the cells specifically to go there in order to, these are loaded into the risk complex, which is called the RNA-induced silencing complex, and leading to the passenger siRNA strand removed, leading to the degradation and the cleavage of the PCK9 messenger RNA, and PCK9 messenger RNA degradation here will end in the upregulation of the LDL receptors, decreasing serum LDL cholesterol levels, and it is taken twice per year. Here, the inclisiran siRNA messenger PCK9 chemical structure here, we can see the backbone modifications and the 2' modifications here. There is increased stability, which protect against endonucleases, so it is stable. Increased the specificity, the GNAC binds to the HGR receptor directly, and there is increased longevity. Loaded risk has long half-life. So this is a very specific drug in order to decrease the PCK9 and preventing its formation from the cells. A strong, consistent efficacy across the Orion 9, 10, and 11, demonstrating rapid, potent, and durable LDL cholesterol lowering using inclisiran over 3,600 atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, familial hypercholesteremic patients, 18 months treatment, inclisiran on top of maximal tolerated statins, ezetimibe allowed. We can see here there is a consistent reduction of the LDL cholesterol by about 58% in the Orion 10 and Orion 11, 50, 54, and and it covers the whole year by the reduction of LDL cholesterol. The reductions of LDL cholesterol day 510 as high as 58%, more than 50% in all populations, and reductions observed at days 90 and were broadly stable long term by day 540 over dosing period 6 months. Met all key secondary endpoints, LDL cholesterol change over time, changes in PCSK9 and other lipids. And the safety comparable placebo here, we can see this is very, very safe. There is no side effects, and a pre-specified exploratory cardiovascular endpoint we can see here that they have a reduction of all-cause deaths and cardiovascular deaths, and this lead to the Orion 4 outcome study designed to confirm the MACE and the cardiovascular mortality benefit over 5 years. As we see, we should wait for the results of the cardiovascular outcome. Now we come to the CRISPR. The CRISPR is a clustered, regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats. It means that the CRISPR-Cas9 system for genome editing. What is that? Goal here is to turn off the PCSK9 gene and to stop liver protein production with a single spelling change in the DNA sequence in liver cells. How is happening? Adenine base editor makes A to G, as we see here. As we see here, the spelling change in canonical splice site at the end of exon 1. It means that this one shot of this editing of the cluster regularly interspaced will abolish the sgRNA completely. What is that? One-time infusion intravenous, and the drug product is a messenger RNA for adenine base editor plus guide RNA targeting PCSK9 gene with post-picked in a lipid nanoparticle. When we see here that they deliver the drug called Verve 101 via intravenous infusion into the blood. This Verve 101 gets taken up into the liver. The gRNA and the messenger RNA are ultimately released inside the liver cells into the cytoplasm. And we can see here the messenger RNA is translated into the base editing protein ABE, which binds to the gRNA and together travel to the nucleus. Within the nucleus, this complex scans the DNA using the gRNA to find the target gene, PCSK9, and makes a specific A to G spelling change within the gene. And then we can see a single spelling change in the DNA sequence permanently turns off the PCSK9 gene forever, leading to turning off the PCSK9 genes resulted in lower blood LDL cholesterol lifelong, and thus it treats a serious cardiovascular disease. Is it a dream? We will see in the future this CRISPR or the gene editing. If we do it from the beginning of life, we will never have LDL cholesterol in our blood. This is the experiment of non-human primate studies design in vivo adenine base editing, and this is the lipid nanoparticle, the intravenous infusions of the test article, which contain messenger RNA, ABE, gRNA, PCSK9 lipid nanoparticle, and this is the control. And the other arm is the messenger RNA, ABE, gRNA, the angioPTL3 lipid nanoparticle. And the primary endpoints here at 2 weeks: liver editing, blood protein level, and the blood lipid level. And it will be taken by rats, and we will see the evidence of that. The base editing to turn off the PCSK9, as we see here in vivo, leads to 89% lower plasma PCSK9 protein and 59% lower plasma LDL in animals. If we use it in human, we will see what will happen for the PCSK9. Another targets of RNA-based drugs here is the target of the ApoC3 to decrease the triglyceride-rich lipoprotein, the ApoA to decrease the lipoprotein A, and the NGPTL3 to decrease the triglyceride-rich lipoprotein, decreasing the LDL cholesterol by an unknown mechanism, and decreasing HDL cholesterol. We see here that the ApoA, ApoC3, and the NGPTL3 are using now many drugs after subcutaneous injections bind to respective messenger RNAs in the liver to inhibit the protein synthesis. We will see here the angiopoietin-like protein 3. This angiopoietin-like protein 3 inhibition lowers LDL cholesterol through very low density lipoprotein remodeling and remnant clearance. Schematic description, the mechanism of how ANGPTL3 inhibition lowers the LDL cholesterol. And we can see in the upper panel here, during the homeostasis of ANGPTL3 curbs vascular lipases, LPL and EL, and thus regulates the ApoB containing lipoprotein turnover. The middle panel here shows the ANGPTL3 inhibition leads to depression of phospholipases, promoting very low density lipoprotein remodeling and preferential removal of the very low density lipoprotein remnants from the circulation via redundant receptors. The ANGPTL3 inhibition hence lowers LDL cholesterol by limiting vascular LDL production. Lower panel show that EL is critical in the process without EL. We can see here the earlier studies revealed that ANGPTL3 blockade lowers LDL cholesterol independently of LDL receptor, providing a new therapeutic avenue for the treatment of familial hypercholesterolemia. And this is the effect of the ANGPTL3 loss of function mutations on lipid phenotypes, pooled analysis in 115 subjects with FHPL2. As we see, all the p-value is highly significant in patients with heterozygous or homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. Two different strategies are under investigation to inhibit the ANGPTL3. An antisense oligonucleotide, ASO, ANGPTL3-LRx, and the monoclonal antibody, the evanacumab, both reducing plasma LDL cholesterol and the triglyceride levels. The mechanism of the antisense oligonucleotides, as we see here, this antisense oligonucleotides can block the translation and thus inhibit protein production, RNase H mechanism. We here can see the antisense oligonucleotides therapy to block the translation of the ANGPTL3 protein. It calls Ionis ANGPTL3-RX. We can see here the translation of the messenger RNA, and here is the transcription. If we take the antisense drug here, the RNase degrades and messenger RNA, no translation, no disease-associated proteins induced. The conclusion from the phase 1 trial on the Ionis ANGPTL3-RX reduced plasma levels of ANGPTL3 up to 83% in healthy volunteers with elevated triglyceride levels. Significant mean reductions were noted in triglyceride, about 66%. ApoC3 decreased by 68%. LDL cholesterol decreased by 35%. Total cholesterol decreased by 36%. HDL cholesterol decreased by 25%, and this is some critic. And non-HDL cholesterol is reduced by 40%. Among all known therapies that lower triglyceride levels, this is associated not only with reduced levels of LDL cholesterol, but total ApoB as well. No safety concerns were identified related to target reduction or drug administration. The Ionis ANGPTL3-LRx is a promising candidate for patients with poorly controlled LDL cholesterol, elevated triglyceride, and possibly in patients with hepatic steatosis and NASH. The evanacumab is a fully human monoclonal antibody targeting the ANGPTL3, able to reduce LDL cholesterol up to 23% and triglyceride up to 76% levels in healthy volunteers. And we can see here the effects of the evanacumab on triglyceride levels in human volunteers, and the ELLIPSE study on homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia with a great reduction of LDL levels and absolute change in levels reaching to 100 milligram per deciliter. The ELIPSE homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia trial evaluating the efficacy of the evenocumab from Regeneron in the treatment of patients with homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia was 65 persons taking evenocumab intravenous every 4 weeks versus placebo. The background was lowering lipid lower treatment. Statins, statins were 98% taking statins, PCSK9 inhibitors 81, ezetimibe 75, LDL apheresis 33, lumatriptan 26%. The results is LDL cholesterol reduced by 49% in evenocumab versus placebo, and the most common treatment-associated adverse events include influenza-like illness and rhinorrhea. And here are the low-density lipoprotein receptor function and responses to the evenocumab at 4 weeks, which was significant. The human anti-GBLT3 monoclonal antibodies have been shown to lower LDL cholesterol in homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia treated with statins, ezetimibe, and PCSK9 inhibitors, allowing more patients to achieve recommended LDL cholesterol target, and this is evolution. Human anti-NGBLT3 monoclonal antibodies have been shown to lower triglyceride in patients with severe hypertriglyceridemia and potentially the risk of acute pancreatitis, and this is revolution. So beyond the LDL cholesterol, we still have some residual risk. This is the ApoC3. ApoC3 promotes hypertriglyceridemia via different mechanisms. It inhibits the lipolysis via inhibiting lipoprotein lipase and hepatic.
But I'll give you another piece of information that complicates the issue much more aggressively. Suffice to know that some genetic loci are responsible for multiple lipid disorders. A single genetic locus can be involved in 1, 2, 3, or even 4 different lipid disorders. So, how can we use or make utility of this huge amount of information? Importantly, we can create a polygenic score. And to understand the basics of what we call polygenic score, suffice to know that if we used individual SNPs, as you can see in this forest plot, the individual SNPs, the predictive ability of them is very low. However, if they are combined, the estimate will be larger. In other words, you can enhance the predictive ability of single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNPs by combining them into a polygenic score. And to understand more deeply, let's look to the figure on the right side of the screen. The x-axis represents the score itself in terms of the value of the score, whether 20, 30, 40, and so on. The y-axis on the extreme right of the screen reveals the LDL cholesterol level, and as you can easily appreciate, the higher the score, the more the LDL cholesterol level. But the y-axis on the middle represents the percentage of the population. And as a rule in life, most populations belong to the middle of the value of the score. In other words, a very little amount belongs to the very low value of the score, and a very little amount belongs to the highest value of the score, and in between you have the vast majority of the population. But importantly, the higher the polygenic score, the higher the projected or predicted LDL cholesterol level. And if we had a review of genome-wide association studies across years, back in 2010, we had just 100,000 SNPs, mostly from European ancestry, in which the investigators were able to define just 95 genetic loci associated with different lipid disorders. And 3 years after that, in 2013, we had, and sit down for this, doubling of the amount of SNPs, 200,000 from more than 7,000 now non-European ancestry, and we were able to add an additive 62 novel genetic loci. And just 2 or 3 years ago, in 2018, the investigators were able to obtain 600,000 SNPs from more than 85 non-European population, and they were able to add an additional amount of 118 genetic loci. What I would like to say is that with the passage of the time, we have accumulating addition of novel genetic loci that are associated with lipid disorders. But the very important piece of information is that if we obtained larger samples, many previously non-significant loci will become significant in terms of prediction. Again, you can enhance or inflate the predictive ability of any genetic locus by involving it with its sister in a polygenic risk score. I hope it is clear. But what's the relation between polygenic risk score for prediction of LDL cholesterol and familial hypercholesterolemia? This is the core of the lecture. Going back to the basic clinical science, we learned from the Dutch Lipid Clinic Network that it used four important clinical criteria to diagnose FH: the family history, the clinical history, the physical examination, in addition to the LDL cholesterol level itself. This is in addition to a gene-based diagnosis, the DNA analysis. In other words, you can diagnose FH nearly definitely using only the genetic score or the genetic test, or using purely clinical data without any touch on the genetic issue. To illustrate this issue much more deeply, let's look to this very important article that was published back 5 or 6 years ago in the European Heart Journal, in which you can appreciate that about 1 in every 5 patients with FH are diagnosed solely or only on clinical background without any genetic test. And a similar amount, 20% of FH cases, are diagnosed only based on clinical backgrounds or genetic backgrounds without touching the clinical issues. But the vast majority or most patients with FH are diagnosed based on combination between clinical data and genetic data, and this could have a great ramification and implications for further family counseling and further treating the LDL cholesterol level itself. Importantly, you should take from this slide that there is a great overlap between the clinical diagnosis and the genetic diagnosis. I'd like to draw your attention to this very interesting paper that was published in Lancet in 2013, in which, in this case control study, the investigators used an LDL cholesterol gene score to differentiate or distinguish patients with polygenic origin from those patients with monogenic origin of familial hypercholesterolemia. And we know that FH could have both monogenic cause or a polygenic cause. The authors concluded that in a substantial proportion of patients with FH without a known single mutation, their raised LDL cholesterol concentration might have a polygenic origin. And to illustrate this statement much more deeply, let's look to the figure, in which the red color points to those patients with FH without a single mutation. As you can appreciate, their LDL weight gene score is larger than the blue color, which is denoting patients with FH with a single mutation. So patients with FH without a known single mutation have higher LDL gene score compared to those patients with FH with a well-known single mutation, and this illustrates beautifully the importance of an LDL gene score. And in a very important paper published in Nature Communication, the investigators showed that having a high polygenic score, the one that I have just mentioned in the previous slide, rather than a monogenic one, is much more statistically significantly affecting the odds of having an extremely high LDL cholesterol. And to illustrate this, let's look to the table at the bottom of the screen. As you can see, the number of patients having a high polygenic score is about more than 10 folds higher than the number of the patients having a monogenic origin of FH. And I'd like you to compare the p-value for a high polygenic score. It's horrific, and I will pronounce it for you. 5.7 multiplied by 10 power to minus 36. Can you imagine? Compare this horrific p-value to the p-value which explains the statistical significance of a monogenic carrier, which is acceptable, 1.4 multiplied by 10 powered by minus 5. Compare this horrific p-value, unbelievable, to this logic p-value, and you will appreciate how could high polygenic score be statistically denoting the odds of having an extremely high future LDL cholesterol. But a very pressing question that blooms in the mind now is, how could we correlate a polygenic score for LDL or familial hypercholesterolemia to a polygenic score for coronary artery disease, which is the most feared complication of elevated LDL and familial hypercholesterolemia in specific? I'd like to draw your attention to this recent paper published in 2018 in which the authors correlated the polygenic score for FH to the polygenic score for coronary artery disease. The basic knowledge is that a single mutation in one of the genes responsible for LDL production occurs in one for every 200 individual with a prevalence of 0.5%. Compare this to the prevalence of a polygenic risk score for coronary artery disease, the same prevalence, 1 for every 200 patients. If you have a prevalence of 0.5% for a polygenic risk score for coronary artery disease, you will have more than or equal to 5-fold risk for coronary artery disease, and this is understandable. But if you have the same prevalence, 0.5% of a polygenic risk score for FH, you will have about 3-fold higher risk for coronary artery disease. So we are not so far. 3-folds to 5-folds is not a big difference, is not a big deal. The authors in this paper concluded that a polygenic risk score for FH, the one we are speaking about it today, correlates nearly well with a polygenic risk score for coronary artery disease. But not only this, take that. If you have more FH variants or more SNPs or more genetic loci, of course you will have a more projected prevalence of coronary artery disease. And this will enable you to apply any preventive strategy on a larger sample of population, and this should translate logically into better prevention. And to illustrate this, let's look to the left of the screen, the study done by Teda et al., in which they included only 50 variants or 50 SNPs. As you can see, the projected prevalence of coronary artery disease is just exceeding 6%. If we increase the number of included variants to more than 49,000 variants, Abraham et al. Showed that the projected prevalence of coronary artery disease jumps to about 8%. And here, recently, in genome-wide polygenic score, in which the investigators were able to include more than 6 million variants. Yes, I said it correctly, 6 million variants. The projected prevalence of coronary artery disease will exceed 10%. If I have a projected prevalence for coronary artery disease to that extent large, I will be able to apply any preventive policy on larger number of patients, and this should translate into better prevention. Importantly, we have on the horizon 2 potential clinical applications for this polygenic score. The first is that we can apply this polygenic score in the neonatal period. So very early in life, I can predict whether this individual will develop an extremely high LDL cholesterol in the future or coronary artery disease and so on. And this will help logically for what we call pre-marriage counseling in order to decrease the prevalence of familial hypercholesterolemia in the general population and decrease the prevalence of its complications, including coronary artery disease. My simple take-home message for the sake of time is that, number one, The risk of extremely high LDL cholesterol is similar in monogenic and polygenic carriers. But the very important point is that the number of individuals with polygenic score is about more than 10 folds greater than the number of those patients with monogenic mutation. It means that they provide to us a greater sample to act upon. So, if a polygenic score is applied to these large populations, even starting sometimes at the neonatal age, we might be able to induce huge cost savings, better prediction of coronary artery disease, and ultimately better prevention. I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. This was me, Ahmed Bindari, signing off, and goodbye.
Many thanks, Dr. Ahmed Berdari, for this highly sophisticated lecture for this tough topic. Uh, I would like to ask you if I have to choose only one practical score, which one you will choose and to which extent you validate it in the practical daily life or clinical point of view.
Thank you, Professor Naamani, for this very good practical question at first, and I hope you are doing well, sir. Practically, we have two important scoring systems to diagnose FH: the Dutch Lipid Clinic Network and the Simon-Coombe criteria. In clinical practice, the Dutch Lipid Network criteria is much more applicable because
lipase activities, it delays hepatic clearance of the triglyceride and favors the simply and or secretion of the very low density lipoprotein. We see here some drugs antisense to ApoC3 Rx in familial chylomicron syndrome reduces the fasting plasma ApoC3 and the triglyceride magnificently, and as we see from this initial trials. There is another AKCA, ApoA, LRX, ISIS 681257. This is an antisense oligonucleotide that contains a GNAC lesion which binds to the acylglycoprotein receptors on hepatocytes, leading to enhanced intracellular uptake. It had a 30-fold higher potency than the non-GNAC ACO, thus allowing lower doses and dose intervals for similar therapeutic efficacy. The triglyceride therapies in development are many, as we see here, and the last one is the vupanorsen antisense to ANGPTL3 for triglyceride and cholesterol. And for lipoprotein A therapies in development, we have the AKCA, the AMG 890, and the ROLBA. They are antisense and sRNA to ApoA. And this is the primary endpoint for the reduction of lipoprotein over 4 weeks. At last, this is a snapshot of the current and the emerging therapies for atherosclerotic cardiovascular residual risk reduction, therapies to lower triglyceride, like the EPA, DHA, bimafiprate, ANGPTL3 inhibitors, evalcobab, sRNA, ApoC inhibitors, and we can see the therapies to lower LDL. There is inclisiran, and the therapies to lower lipoprotein A, the ApoA, LRX, AMG, and the anti-inflammatory therapies are under development. Patient adherence is very important. The greatest challenge for us in prevention and treating asymptomatic conditions such as dyslipidemia, and the good new choices and new technologies improve adherence and they change the way preventive cardiology is practiced. As we see here for the future, the adherence improvement is very important. We give the patients high potency statin, monoclonal antibodies. We give them inclisiran, and maybe after that, the vaccination, and that last, it will be the gene editing. We'll find that the adherence will be for the gene editing and the vaccination, and we can find here is the time average reduction in LDL cholesterol is huge here in the era of the inclisiran and the vaccination and the gene editing. So this is the magnitude of exposure of the LDL cholesterol, and we will find that the reduction of the coronary heart disease, this is the impact of imperfect adherence on proportional risk, reduction of coronary heart disease on population level. And thanks for your kind attention.
Thank you, Professor Atif. Actually, it seems that there is a plethora of RNA-based and monoclonal antibody therapy to target many items in the pathways of lipid metabolism. And one of the interesting you presented to us is that of angiopoietin protein 3 inhibitors. Because this inhibition can decrease LDL cholesterol in a mechanism independent of the LDL receptors.
Yeah.
So as you know, in cases of homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, there is no LDL receptors, and
Yes.
all the drugs or maneuvers we are using, trying to increase the LDL receptors to or preserve it to reduce the LDL cholesterol failed because of the scanty LDL receptor present. So if we have a drug like this, which can reduce LDL cholesterol independent of the LDL receptors, it will help a lot of patients with familial hypercholesterolemia. And additionally, it lowered the triglycerides significantly. And actually, when we found the case of severe hypertriglyceridemia, thousands, all the drugs we have, omega-3 and lepanthyl and fibrates and so on, so cannot reduce the triglycerides significantly like this drug. I hope this drug can find place in nearby to help our patients in this category. And the floor is open for discussion for the panelists.
All what you say, Professor Ashraf, is clear and is good and supporting what I say, because mutations of genes is very important. We need labs in Egypt to detect these genes mutations in order to apply our practice in a good way.
Thank you, Dr. Atif.
Dr. Walid.
Very nice presentation as usual. يعني very hot topic الحقيقة, very tough, but at the same time it's very attractive topic actually. My question is يعني as an extension for the comment of Dr. Ashraf about patients with homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. This angiopoietin-like protein 3 يعني opens a new horizon for therapeutic option for those patients. But my question is, as those patients are deprived of LDL receptors, still the drugs that acting on PCSK9 inhibitors inhibition, like PCSK9 inhibitors or the inclisiran that turn off the PCSK9 gene, do these drugs still have a role in treatment of those patients, taking in consideration that they are working on keeping the recycling of the LDL receptor. But those patients already don't have LDL receptor. So these drugs still an option for treatment for those patients, or just we will be waiting for the new therapeutic target like the angiopoietin like protein 3.
Misfortunately, the PCSK9 inhibitors, the statins, the etomib, the apheresis, they are all, they try to decrease the LDL and in patients with homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia because they are poor and they have poor treatment. But I think these new drugs which will target these genes away from the LDL receptor can add beneficial effect for those patients.
May I have a comment on this question, Professor Atif and Professor Walid? Actually, we have to know that homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia is not a single category of disease.
Yes.
That means that not all the patients have no LDL receptors. There is severe with no receptors or very scanty receptors. There is moderate and there is mild. And usually there is some receptors.
There is gene
That's
variant.
why in most of the clinical trials, you give first statin, then ezetimibe, then PCSK9. Then if no response, you can add these new agents or even hemopheresis, plasmapheresis to many of these patients. So it is different severity,
Yes.
not single category.
Inclisiran,
Yes.
Professor Ashraf succeeded to act on gene variants in patients with homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia in Orion 9.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Atif. It's really very interesting and very wonderful presentation. I'd like to ask about this ebinacumab. Is there any outcome trial or any data regarding decrease in the heart outcomes? Any trial for this drug?
It is running on, and the results will appear after 4 years from now.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Atif, many thanks for the very elegant presentation.
Professor
I
Normani.
have a question. It is well known that inclisiran or Leqvio have many advantage over PCSK9 inhibition in the traditional way. But all the trials, especially program for inclisiran, is linked to the use in adjuvant way. Do we have any data about the use with ezetimibe or fenofibrates or eco-70 especially in diabetic patients at very high risk with hypertriglyceridemia? Do you have any data about this?
About inclisiran?
Yes.
The inclisiran is an add-on on high-intensity statin plus ezetimibe
statin, yes.
on these patients in all the trials. It is not alone, but there is no evidence up till now. There is no data about using eco-70 or using fenofibrates on those patients with inclisiran.
I think we can move Dr. Normani to the next presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Atif, and we will the next presentation. I can please share screen, please.
في 30 ثانية بريك.
Yeah, Bindeli, Dr. Bindeli.
Okay, احنا ready?
Okay.
Okay. Many thanks, Professor Ashraf Reda, for arrangement of this highly educational series about essentials of dyslipidemia. It is my honor and great pleasure to present one of the field of cardiovascular medicine, Dr. Ahmed Bindari. Dr. Ahmed will highlight another important topic, which is familial hypercholesterolemia genetic risk scoring. Dr. Ahmed, اتفضل.
Thank you, Professor Normani, for this nice introduction, and thanks for IAVA, my second family, for inviting me. Today, we are going to touch a little bit complex issue in the clinical management of patients with familial hypercholesterolemia or FH. And this is the familial hypercholesterolemia or FH genetic risk scoring. And we are trying to answer a very important question. This is a complex issue and is usually non-understandable. Can we understand the ununderstandable? I'll start by some definitions in order to be familiar with the remainder of the presentation. The first is what we call single nucleotide polymorphism, which is abbreviated SNP and pronounced SNP, which is a DNA sequence variation in which one of the nucleotides, whether guanine, cytosine, thymine, or adenine, varies between different members of the species or between the paired chromosomes in the same individual. These SNPs are being studied in what we call the genome-wide association studies, or GWAS, in which millions of individuals, whether FH diagnosed patients and non-FH patients, we extract the DNA from them. So at the end of the day, we have two sets of DNA, the patient DNA and the non-patient DNA. And this enables us to compare the differences to discover the SNPs specific to the disease, or in other words, to have what we call disease specific SNPs and the non-disease specific SNPs. Importantly, through these genome-wide association studies, we were able to obtain hundreds of genetic loci that are associated with different lipid disorders. I know that these are very complex. It easily incorporates both clinical and genetic testing. It means that if genetic testing cannot be done for whatever reason, for financial reasons, for example, I can easily use the clinical presentation, family history, clinical examination, densitometers, and so on, in addition to the LDL cholesterol level to diagnose FH. The Simon Broom criteria is not... Okay.
My of the question, Ahmed, we have any clinical data or prospective data or studies that correlate the predetermined clinical risk scoring with the outcome? You have any data?
Up till now, we have no data providing the utility of a well-validated polygenic risk score to diagnose familial hypercholesterolemia or to predict LDL. All these studies are still in the production or in the factory, let's say that. But in the future, once one of these polygenic score is validated to be used as a clinical tool, of course, the next step is to correlate its use with a clinical long-term outcome. But up till now, we do not have these data yet, sir.
I think, Mohammed, the importance or the value of genetic risk score is trying to predict early those subjected to ischemic heart disease in the future, to start preventive measures early. And actually, genetic risk score is not only related to dyslipidemia, it is related to many gene loci that are related to obesity, metabolic syndrome, hypertension. And all of this can help in early prediction and early preventive measures. I hope, and I think this will the future of medicine, to predict those liable to ischemic heart disease early in the course of the disease.
Yes.
Dr. Ahmed, thank you for the excellent presentation.
Thank you, Professor Walid.
Actually, very important topic. I would like to ask you from the practical point of view, what's the patient profile you may see in your clinic or in daily practice on which you want to apply this risk score, and you may ask him to bring his siblings, his brothers, like this. You depend on the lipid profile or on the family history of coronary disease, or what do you think?
Thank you, Professor Walid, for this question. This is a very beautiful one. The most important, let's say, two patient profiles that raise suspicion for the presence of FH in the clinical practice are: number one, those patients coming with exceedingly high LDL cholesterol, for example, LDL 190 or more, number one. Or those patients presenting with premature coronary artery disease or premature atherosclerotic vascular disease in general in males below than 55 and in females below than 65, in addition to an LDL cholesterol level exceeding 150. Suffice to know, if you apply Dutch lipid network to the last profile, they are simply, without any other additional criteria, at probable risk for FH. Those are the most important two profiles to consider FH in the clinical practice, in addition to other lesser common profiles.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bandari.
Thank
so
you,
much.
sir. Thank you very much.
I think if there is no other comment, we can conclude this important, nice, and sophisticated sessions. But all of us have to know about genetics, about polymorphisms, about drugs, new drugs, about the risk scoring system. And I hope you enjoy these presentations. And thank you all. Thank you for the faculty. Thank you for the speakers. And thank you for ICOM and Novartis. And see you later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Thank you.